how do you know, well, anything? Serious, just for a second. How do you actually decide what's true?
Yeah.
Why do you just, expect the sun to pop up tomorrow or trust someone's word? We're constantly making these assumptions, right? Predicting things.
We are. It's sort of automatic. We rarely stop to think how we're doing it. What's going on under the hood?
Yeah, what are the foundations, the mental gears?
Exactly. What are the basic building blocks? How do thoughts even link together? And what's the real difference between knowing something and just like really strongly believing it?
It feels fundamental.
It is. Probing these questions, it can be rigorous, maybe a bit uncomfortable even, but it's so revealing about how our own minds work.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do in this deep dive. We're peeling back the layers, looking at excerpts from this classic text. It takes a really sharp look at the roots of knowledge, belief, the whole shebang.
Right. And this philosopher, they really go for it, breaking down everything from simple ideas, sensations, all the way up to big concepts like cause and effect, freedom.
Even miracles, which is fascinating.
Definitely. Now, the text itself points out there are kind of two ways to approach philosophy.
Right.
There's let's call it the easy way, accessible. It focuses on human action, feelings, taste. It's practical, designed to make us better people or navigate society.
Right, the kind that feels good, maybe helps you get along with others, avoids the really thorny, abstract stuff.
Pretty much. It doesn't want to clash too much with common sense.
Hey.
Then there's the other path, the accurate but often harder, more abstruse way.
Metaphysics, right, digging into the mind itself.
Exactly, the internal workings.
Yeah.
And the text admits, it can feel a bit painful, like dissecting something. Not exactly glamorous.
But I love the analogy the source uses for this, that this anatomy of the mind, this tough part, is actually needed for the easy, practical philosophy to be any good.
Right, like anatomy for a painter.
Yeah. You need to know the bones and muscles, the structure underneath, even if you're just painting the surface, the beautiful portrait.
Precisely. Without that deep understanding of the mental machinery, the practical stuff lacks precision, lacks rigor. It's appreciating the surface versus knowing how the engine works.
So our goal today is to, brave these potentially deep waters with you using this text as our guide.
And pull out some of the really maybe surprising insights about how your own mind operates. And maybe, just maybe, what the actual limits of our understanding might be.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. The absolute basics, according to this philosopher. They say all our perceptions, like everything in our heads, boils down to two kinds: impressions and ideas. What's the difference?
It's basically about intensity, how vivid, how forceful they are. Impressions are the really lively ones. Like actually feeling the heat from a fire right now, seeing red, hearing a loud noise, or feeling strong emotions, love, anger as they happen, direct impact.
Okay, raw data, direct experience, feelings.
Got it. Ideas, then, are the faint copies, the echoes.
So thinking about the fire later, remembering the red color, reflecting on feeling angry yesterday.
Exactly. Less lively, less forceful, fainter.
Impressions, direct hit, ideas.
The memory, the thought about the hit. Okay.
And here's the absolute bedrock principle. This is central. All our ideas come from impressions that happened before.
All of them. No exceptions.
That's the claim. Every idea traces back to a prior impression. The mind, in this view, it isn't creating totally new fundamental stuff from nothing.
So it's more like a remixer.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It takes the raw materials, the impressions from senses or feelings, and it mixes them, combines them, maybe makes them bigger or smaller in the mind.
Like the classic Golden Mountain example, you've had an impression of gold, an impression of a mountain.
And your mind sticks them together. Or a virtuous horse. You have an impression of virtue, maybe an inner feeling, and an impression of a horse. Combine them.
But the basic building blocks, the gold, the mountain, the virtue, the horse, they all came from experience first. Exactly. The fundamental bits must have an origin in sensation or feeling. The text even throws down a challenge, basically saying, if you claim you have an idea that didn't come from an impression, show me the impression. Produce the original. And if you can't, well, the suspicion is it's maybe just meaningless jargon. Philosophical hot air.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty sharp razor for cutting through abstract talk. Is there any wiggle room? Did the philosopher find any idea that maybe doesn't fit this perfectly?
Well, there's this one tiny, very specific example mentioned. It's treated as a kind of outlier, really. Not enough to break the rule.
What is it?
It's this hypothetical case. Imagine someone's seen every single shade of blue. except for one specific shade, right in the middle of the spectrum.
Okay.
Could they, just by looking at all the other shades arranged in order, could they imagine that missing shade, form an idea of it without ever having the direct impression?
That's interesting, like filling in a gap based on the pattern.
Exactly. The text kind of shrugs and says, well, maybe the mind could do that tiny little thing, but it's so singular, so minor, it doesn't really challenge the main principle that our complex ideas are built from simpler impressions we've actually had.
So the rule pretty much stands, and it's useful for clarity, right? Trace your abstract terms back.
Huge practical use. Find the impression or be suspicious of the idea. It helps banish jargon.
Makes sense. Okay, so we have these building blocks impressions leading to ideas, but our thoughts aren't just a jumbled mess, are they? They seem connected. How does that happen?
Right. They're definitely not random. Even when your mind is wandering, there's still some kind of connection, a thread.
A train of thought, like you said.
Exactly. And the text argues there are just three simple principles of association. Three ways ideas naturally link up in our minds. These are the only bonds that create that regular flow.
Okay, what are the three?
They are resemblance, contiguity, which means closeness in time or place, and causation, or cause and effect.
Okay, let's see. Resemblance. A picture makes you think of the real person. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Contiguity. Thinking about one room in your house makes you think of the room next door.
Right, because they're close together.
And causation. Seeing smoke makes you think of fire.
Perfect. Because one usually causes or is seen with the other. These are the sort of hidden guide ropes for our thoughts.
That's really neat. Simple, but powerful. Okay, so we've got ideas linked together. Now, how do we actually use these to reason about stuff? The text splits human reasoning into two kinds.
Yes, this is a really crucial distinction. Relations of ideas versus matters of fact.
Relations of ideas first. What are those?
These are truths you can figure out just by thinking. By demonstration. You don't need to check the outside world. Think geometry, algebra, logic.
Like the Pythagorean theorem.
Yeah.
Or 3 times 5 is half of 30.
Exactly. Those are true whether or not perfect triangles or groups of 15 actually exist anywhere. You just need to understand the ideas involved.
Their opposite is impossible, inconceivable, a logical contradiction.
Right. Demonstrative reasoning, certainty lives here.
Okay. And then the other kind, matters of fact.
Now we're talking about the world as it actually is. Existence. And here's where it gets, well, a bit mind-bending maybe.
How so?
The text claims that the opposite of every matter of fact is always possible. It never implies a logical contradiction.
Like your example earlier, the sun will not rise tomorrow. I can perfectly well imagine that, even if I fully expect it to rise. It doesn't break logic like 2 plus 2v5 does.
Exactly. You can picture it without logical absurdity. And because of this, the evidence we have for matters of fact is fundamentally different from the kind of proof we have for relations of ideas.
Different how?
You can't, the text argues, figure out truths about matters of fact just by reasoning alone, before you have any experience. A priori, they call it.
Yeah.
You can't deduce fire is hot just by thinking about the concept of fire without ever feeling it.
Okay, that leads us right into one of the biggest points, doesn't it? The whole puzzle of cause and effect.
Absolutely. This is maybe the most famous part. The argument is that all our knowledge about cause and effect comes only from experience, not from reason working on its own.
So I can't just look at something new, say the strange rock I found, and deduce purely by thinking what effect it will have if I don't know, drop it in water.
Nope. The source uses examples like showing someone pieces of marble for the first time. They can't reason out that they'll stick together strongly if polished smooth.
Right.
Or showing someone heat applied to crystal, or extreme cold to water if they've never seen it before. They can't just deduce melting or freezing by pure logic. Any guess they make seems equally possible, rationally speaking, before they see it happen.
So reason alone is blind to future effects when faced with something new. You have to watch and see.
That's the idea. You need observation, experience. This is why, the text says, no truly rational philosopher pretends to know the ultimate cause of anything in nature, the deep-down secret connection. We only know how things tend to behave because we've seen them do it, repeatedly.
We see the constant conjunction, as the text calls it, one thing following another, again and again.
Yes, but we don't perceive some hidden power or necessary force that reason alone can grasp, connecting them.
Okay, that makes sense for learning specific connections, fire burns, dropping things makes them fall. But what about the bigger picture? Why do we trust experience at all? Why assume the future will be like the past? What's the basis for that fundamental belief?
Now you're getting to the really deep, maybe even unsettling question the text raises. If cause and effect knowledge comes from experience, what's the foundation for conclusions drawn from that experience? Why does seeing A followed by B 1,000 times make us so sure B will follow the next time we see A?
My gut reaction is, well, because it always has. Experience works. The past has been a reliable guide.
And the text points out the logical trap there. You're trying to justify trusting future experience by appealing to past experience.
Oh,
Any argument you make for the principle the future will resemble the past already assumes that very principle to get off the ground. You're using experience-based arguments, probable arguments, to prove the validity of experience-based arguments.
it's circular. Wow. Okay. That really does feel like the rug's being pulled out a bit. So
Yeah.
if it's not logic, not a rational proof,
Yeah.
then what? Why do we expect the future to be like the past?
This is the revolutionary answer the text gives. It's not reason. It's custom or habit.
Habit. Just habit, not logic.
Yes, custom habit is what makes experience useful for us. It's this ingrained habit built up by seeing things happen over and over that makes the mind automatically expect the usual outcome when it sees the usual cause.
Like the egg example from the text. All eggs look similar, but you only expect nourishment from one after you've cracked open many and found them good to eat. That repetition builds the expectation.
Exactly. Confidence comes from repeated experience, from habit, not from some logical deduction about the universe's consistency.
So even after a million sunrises, there's no purely rational argument that forces me to conclude it has to rise tomorrow. My certainty is a really, really strong habit.
That's the core argument. The mind makes a leap in inference from past observations to future predictions that isn't actually supported by any chain of deductive reasoning.
Yeah.
It's more like an instinct, a powerful, built-in principle of human nature.
Nature just makes us do it, regardless of philosophical doubt.
Right. As the text says, nature maintains her rights. We act on custom. We have to.
Okay, that's profound. And kind of humbling for our rational pretensions. So if expecting the future is habit, what about belief itself? What makes believing the sun will rise different from just, I don't know, imagining it will rise? What separates belief from mere fiction in our minds?
That's the next big puzzle tackled. Because we can imagine all sorts of things very vividly, right? Dragons, historical events that never occurred. We can picture them clearly.
But we don't believe they're real.
Exactly. So the difference can't just be adding some extra idea, like an idea of reality, to the mix. The content seems the same whether imagined or believed.
So it's not what we're thinking about, it's how we're thinking about it, the quality of the thought.
Precisely. The text argues belief is a sentiment or feeling that goes along with the conception. It's a different manner of conceiving the idea.
A feeling. Belief is a feeling. That sounds really counterintuitive, too.
It does, doesn't it? But the claim is that belief is a conception that is more vivid, more lively, more forcible, firm, steady than what pure imagination can achieve. It feels different. It has more weight, more impact on our thoughts and actions.
Okay. A more intense way of holding an idea in the mind. Where does this feeling, this intensity come from?
It arises, according to the text, from the customary conjunction of an object with something that's present right now to our memory or our senses. It links back directly to those principles of association, especially cause and effect driven by custom.
Ah, okay. The analogies in the text help here, like seeing a picture of an old friend, that's resemblance.
Right.
It doesn't just bring up the idea of the friend, it makes the idea more lively, brings the feelings associated with them closer, more real somehow.
Exactly. Or being physically near your home contiguity makes your ideas of safety and comfort feel stronger, more vivid.
Okay.
And the argument is that the feeling of belief arising from cause and effect works similarly. Seeing smoke doesn't just trigger the idea of fire. Because of the strong customary link, your mind makes that rapid, almost involuntary transition. And that transition itself generates this vivid, forceful feeling, the belief that fire is actually present.
So belief is the strong feeling, this forceful way of thinking about something, generated by the mind's habitual jump from a present perception to its usual partner idea.
That's the essence of it, a natural, almost instinctual operation of the mind, shaped by repeated experience and custom. As unavoidable, the text suggests, as feeling love when treated kindly or anger when provoked.
Wow. That really paints belief as less of a cold, rational decision and more of a gut feeling driven by habit. Which brings us back around to that tricky idea we touched on. Necessary connection. If we only see sequence, A, then B, where does the idea that A necessarily causes B, that there's a power or force involved, actually come from?
Right. That's a notoriously slippery concept in philosophy. And the text argues, again, that you don't get this idea just by looking at one instance, watching one billiard ball hit another.
You just see movement, then contact, then more movement, sequence.
Exactly. No visible power or glue connecting them.
Yeah.
So the theory proposed is that the idea of necessary connection doesn't come from observing a single event, but from observing many similar instances.
Repetition again.
Yes. When you see A followed by B constantly, over and over and over, something new happens in your mind. It produces a new impression.
An impression. But I'm not seeing anything new out there.
No, it's an internal impression this time. It's the feeling or the internal sensation of your mind making that customary transition. When you see A, your mind, out of habit, is just carried along to expect B, to believe B will happen. That feeling, that internal push or determination to move from one idea to the associated one. That is the original impression from which we get the idea of power, force, or necessity.
Whoa. Hang on. So the necessary connection isn't something between the objects, but it's a feeling inside me that arises from my mind's habit, which I then kind of project onto the objects.
That's precisely the argument. The necessity we feel is the mind's determination, born of custom, to pass from cause to effect. We have no other clear idea of necessity or power beyond, 1, the constant conjunction of objects, and 2, this consequent inference or feeling in the mind.
So it's subjective, in a sense, rooted in our psychology, not in the external world's physics.
Rooted in the predictable operations of the human mind as it interacts with observed regularities. The text also looks at other places people might think this idea comes from, like feeling we have power over our own bodies, or the idea of God's will, and argues that even there, we only observe the command and then the event, not the actual power itself.
This just keeps shifting the ground, moving concepts we think are out there into the workings of our own minds based on experience. Radical stuff.
It definitely is. It reframes our understanding of causality quite dramatically.
Okay, let's shift to another huge philosophical battleground where this framework gets applied. Liberty and necessity. Free will versus determinism. The text makes a bold claim here too, right? That the whole fight might just be about words.
Yes, that's the provocative suggestion. If we just define our terms carefully, based on the understanding of cause and effect necessity we just discussed, maybe everyone actually agrees already.
Oh, so what's the definition of necessity being used here?
Necessity, in this context, just means two things. The constant conjunction of similar events, like certain motives usually leading to certain actions, and the resulting inference the mind makes from one to the other. We predict the action based on the motive.
Okay.
And the argument is that this kind of necessity, regularity, and predictability clearly applies to human actions.
But wait, that sounds like it kills free will if our actions are necessitated like billiard balls.
But remember the definition. It's not about irresistible fate. It's about the uniformity we observe in human nature. Across time, across cultures, similar motives tend to produce similar actions. We rely on this constantly.
How do we rely on it?
Think about it. Politicians predict how groups will vote based on interests. Merchants forecast demand based on past behavior. An employer trusts an employee will show up based on past reliability. All social life depends on inferring actions from character and circumstances. We predict human behavior based on experience, just like we predict physical events.
So we're constantly acting as if there's a predictable link between motives, character, and actions. That's the necessity part, the observed regularity.
Exactly. That uniformity allows for inference. It's not some metaphysical compulsion, just observable, predictable patterns.
Okay, if that's necessity, then what is liberty according to this view?
Liberty isn't the opposite of this kind of necessity. It's not about actions being random or disconnected from motives. That would be chance, not freedom. Liberty is simply defined as the power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of your own will.
So if I decide to raise my hand, and I can raise my hand, I'm not tied up or anything, then I have liberty in that action.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's a hypothetical liberty, if you will it. You can do it. Anyone who isn't literally a prisoner in chains has this liberty regarding their actions.
So I can have both. My action can be free, I did what I willed to do, and necessary. It predictably followed from my motives and character in a way someone who knows me might infer.
That's the core claim. All humankind, the text argues, has always implicitly agreed on both. Necessity, in the sense of uniformity and inference, and liberty, in the sense of acting according to will. The philosophical arguments arise from misunderstanding or misapplying the terms, maybe confusing liberty with pure randomness.
And kind of surprisingly, the text even argues that both this kind of necessity and this liberty are essential for morality to make sense.
Yes, that's a key point. Necessity, the link between action and durable character, is needed so that actions actually reflect who a person is, making praise or blame meaningful. If actions were random chance, how could you hold someone accountable?
Right, the action wouldn't tell you anything about the person.
And liberty, the power to act as willed, is needed for actions to be considered voluntary, which is usually seen as a prerequisite for moral judgment. You don't blame someone for something they were physically forced to do.
So it neatly dissolves this age-old conflict by redefining the terms based on observable experience.
It's an attempt to show the conflict is based on ambiguity, not a genuine contradiction in how things work based on empirical observation.
And sticking with observation and experience, the text even brings the reason of animals into this.
Right. It points out that animals obviously learn from experience too. They infer causes from effects, expect things based on past events.
Like an old dog knowing how to corner its prey, or a horse learning how high it can jump.
Exactly. They adjust behavior based on outcomes.
Yeah.
And the argument is they're not doing this through complex philosophical reasoning about nature's uniformity.
Probably not.
It's instinct or custom or habit. And the text draws a direct parallel. Just like the animal's learning is based on habit, so too is the most fundamental human inference from experience, expecting the future to be like the past, also rooted in custom and habit, not abstract reason. It reinforces the idea of habit as a fundamental principle across thinking beings.
That's a really interesting comparison. Okay, let's shift gears again to another major application of this whole framework, and it's a controversial one, the challenge of miracles. How does this philosophy approach claims of the miraculous?
Well, it starts by defining how a wise person evaluates evidence in general. They proportion their belief to the strength of the evidence. Meaning you weigh things up, you look at experiments, observations, testimony on both sides of an issue, and you lean towards the side that has the greater weight of evidence. It's about probability versus proof.
Okay, and this applies directly to how we judge what people tell us, human testimony.
Absolutely. Our trust in testimony isn't blind. It comes from our lifelong experience of how often reports from certain kinds of people in certain kinds of situations turn out to be true. We learn to assess credibility based on character, the number of witnesses, potential biases, how the story is told, all based on observing the conjunction between reports and reality.
And naturally, if someone reports something really unusual, really out of the ordinary,
our belief diminishes, right? It takes stronger testimony to convince us of something extraordinary, like the example of water freezing in a tropical climate may be possible, but very unusual, so you'd need really solid witnesses. But that's still just extraordinary, within the bounds of known natural variation.
A miracle, though, is defined differently here.
Yes, crucially. A miracle is defined as a violation of a law of nature. And a law of nature in this framework is something established by a firm and unalterable uniform experience.
Uniform experience. That sounds like the strongest possible evidence against the miracle happening.
Exactly. A uniform experience amounts to a direct and full proof against the event described as miraculous. So when a wise person hears testimony for a miracle, they face a conflict of evidence.
Testimony versus uniform natural law.
Precisely. They have to weigh the proof from testimony that the event happened against the proof from uniform experience that events of that kind don't happen. And the famous conclusion is,
let me guess. The testimony is rarely, if ever, strong enough.
Essentially, yes. The principle stated is, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish.
Wow. Okay, so you should only believe the miracle story if the witnesses being wrong, mistaken, lying, deceived, would be an even bigger violation of the laws of nature than the miracle itself.
That's the incredibly high bar set. And the text goes on to argue why testimony for religious miracles specifically almost never meets this standard.
Why particularly religious miracles?
Several reasons are given. There's the universal human love of wonder and surprise. We're naturally drawn to the marvelous, which can override critical judgment.
We want to believe.
Yes. Then there's credulity, often heightened by religious passion or enthusiasm. History is also full of accounts of miracles that turned out to be frauds or delusions. Plus, miracle stories often gain traction far from where they supposedly happened, where checking the facts is harder.
Like the example of that charlatan Alexander the Imposter.
Right. His miracles were believed leagues away, but not where he actually lived and operated. And underpinning all this is the constant, unwavering evidence of uniform natural law working against the miraculous claim.
So psychological biases, historical unreliability, lack of local evidence, and the overwhelming weight of regular experience all stack up against miracle testimony.
That's the argument. The text discusses examples like the supposed Jansenist miracles in France at the tomb of Abbé Paris. Despite seemingly strong testimony from educated people, the text attributes it to the power of religious fervor, suggesting such zeal can produce seemingly unbreakable testimony for almost anything.
Even if it defies all normal experience.
It also uses a hypothetical. Imagine Queen Elizabeth I, known to have died, reportedly reappeared and ruled again. Even if historians documented her death, burial, and reappearance publicly.
We wouldn't believe the reappearance part.
Right, because our uniform experience of death being final is a stronger proof against resurrection than any human testimony could be for it.
So the conclusion about religious miracles is
That belief in them isn't and can't be founded on reason or evidence that meets this standard. It must be founded on faith, which is understood as something separate from, or even contrary to, the evidence of experience.
a very strong claim, flowing directly from the initial principles about knowledge and evidence. Okay, this leads into the final main areas dealing with more speculative topics. Providence and a future state, often framed in source as a dialogue. How does the philosopher tackle arguments here?
The text uses the voice of Epicurus, the ancient philosopher, to make a case based on the principle of inferring causes only from observed effects.
Okay, what's the argument?
The core idea is, if we view the world as the effect of some divine cause, we can only justly attribute to that cause the specific qualities, and only in the specific degrees that are necessary to produce the effect we actually see.
So we look at the world with all its mixture of good and bad, order and chaos, pleasure and pain.
Right. And from that mixed effect, we can infer a cause with wisdom, goodness, power, etc., but only commensurate with that mixture. We can't legitimately infer perfect goodness, infinite wisdom, or perfect distributive justice if those qualities aren't fully and perfectly displayed in the world we observe.
We can't jump from the actual world to a perfect creator based only on the evidence of the world itself.
Not according to this line of reasoning. And the crucial consequence follows. If you can't establish those perfect attributes in the cause based on the current effect, then you certainly can't turn around and use those assumed perfect attributes to argue for new effects that we don't see in the current world, like a future state with perfect rewards and punishments designed to rectify the imperfections of this life.
Why not?
Because it's a logical fallacy, a gross sophism, the text calls it. You're inferring the cause only from effect A, the current world, then attributing extra qualities to the cause that aren't fully an A, and then using those extra qualities to predict a totally new effect, B, the afterlife, that isn't part of A either. You're going beyond the evidence at every step.
It's like observing a slightly wobbly machine, concluding the designer must have intended perfect balance, and then using that assumption of perfect intent to predict machine will suddenly run perfectly smooth later on.
That's a good way to think about it. The argument restricts our inferences about the cause, and therefore predictions about future effects, strictly to what's observable in the present world.
But does this view undermine morality? If we can't rationally argue for future rewards and punishments, what's the basis for being good?
The text, speaking as Epicurus again, argues that morality doesn't depend on these speculative theological arguments at all. Morality is grounded in the observable consequences of actions in this life.
How so?
We can see through experience that virtue generally leads to things like peace of mind, self-respect, social harmony, while vice tends to bring mental turmoil, ill health, social disapproval. These natural consequences are enough motivation for rational people to prefer virtue, regardless of beliefs about ultimate causes or an afterlife.
So practical, observable benefits in the here and now are the foundation for morality, not metaphysical deductions.
That's the argument presented. However, the text does acknowledge a counterpoint, realistically. Even if the philosophy is sound, many people's actual beliefs about religion and an afterlife do strongly influence their behavior, whether the reasoning behind those beliefs is strictly logical or not. Beliefs have real-world consequences.
And there's also a plea for tolerance, right? That philosophical speculation, even if it challenges common beliefs, isn't usually dangerous, and trying to suppress it harms science and intellectual progress.
Exactly. Free inquiry is defended as valuable, even when it leads to uncomfortable places.
Okay. So this whole journey from basic ideas to cause and effect, belief, miracles, theology, seems to repeatedly emphasize the limits of pure reason and the dominance of experience, habit, and even feeling, which brings us perfectly to the final topic, the value of skepticism.
Right. And the text makes a key distinction here. First, there's what it calls excessive skepticism or Pyrrhonism.
The kind that doubts absolutely everything.
Yeah. Doubting your senses, doubting that the external world is real, getting tied up in paradoxes about abstract concepts like infinite divisibility, aiming for total suspension of judgment.
Can anyone actually live like that?
The text says no, absolutely not. It's practically impossible. Nature, instinct, the simple demands of daily life, eating, walking, avoiding danger are just too strong. These extreme doubts might seem plausible in a philosophy seminar, but they vanish the moment you step outside.
You can doubt the floor exists, but you still won't try to walk through the wall.
Precisely. Nature always wins. So that kind of radical skepticism is seen as ultimately sterile, unlivable. But then there's another kind,
It is.
mitigated skepticism, also called academical philosophy. And this, the text argues, is actually very useful and durable.
How does this mitigated version work?
It comes from a careful, honest reflection on the limits of human understanding that we've been exploring, recognizing how narrow our faculties are, how easily we fall into error, how much of what we think is solid knowledge is actually based on custom or feeling.
So it's about intellectual humility.
Exactly. Its benefits are promoting modesty, caution, limiting our confidence, making us less dogmatic and more tolerant of others, because we realize how shaky the ground can be for even our own strongest beliefs.
It stops you from being arrogantly certain.
Right. And its main practical consequence is to encourage us to confine our inquiries to subjects that human understanding is actually suited to handle.
And what are those subjects according to this view? Where can we be reasonably confident?
Two main areas. First, abstract reasoning concerning quantity and number, basically, mathematics and logic. Here, demonstration is possible?
Relations of ideas.
Yes. Second, reasoning concerning matters of fact, which is entirely founded on experience, primarily cause and effect, probability, testimony, all grounded in observed regularities.
Matters of fact based on experience. Okay, so math and empirical investigation are the reliable zones. What about everything else? Metaphysics, theology, morals, art criticism.
Well, the implication is that traditional metaphysics and much of theology attempt to go far beyond what reason and experience can establish, often relying heavily on faith or speculation. Morals and criticism, while they can involve reasoning about facts, ultimately often seem grounded in sentiment and taste how things feel to us, which isn't quite the same as demonstrable proof or empirical verification.
So those areas are less certain, more subjective.
Perhaps operating under different rules, less amenable to the kind of certainty we find in math or well-established experimental science, which leads to the famous, rather dramatic closing statement.
The final skeptical punch.
Yes. If we take a book on, say, divinity or traditional metaphysics, does it contain abstract reasoning about quantity or number? No. Does it contain experimental reasoning about matters of fact and existence? No.
Yeah.
Then the text concludes dramatically, committed to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion.
Wow, that's quite a statement. Basically, anything that isn't math logic or empirical science based on experience is suspect.
It's a very strong conclusion, drawing a sharp line around what can be considered reliable human knowledge, suggesting that much of what has passed for philosophy or theology might be built on foundations less secure than custom, feeling, or perhaps even illusion.
Okay, so we have really gone on an intellectual journey today. From the tiny origins of thoughts as impressions to how they connect, how we reason, the surprising huge role of custom and feeling in belief and our understanding of causality.
Right, through the tough standards for evaluating testimony, especially for miracles, the limits on inferring divine attributes, and finally landing on the value of a cautious, experience-grounded skepticism.
It really forces you to look at your own mind and ask, where do my beliefs actually come from? How much is reason? How much is habit? How much is just feeling?
It shifts the focus from assuming we rationally deduce everything to seeing how much we operate on these powerful, experience-driven, habitual mechanisms.
Which really brings us to the final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. Thinking about everything we've discussed today, drawing on this philosopher's deep dive. How much of what you feel absolutely certain about, what you firmly believe about the world? Maybe it's that the sun will rise. Maybe it's a moral conviction. Maybe it's a scientific fact. Maybe it's something else entirely. How much of that certainty is ultimately grounded, not in pure, cold, hard reason or logical proof, but in the incredible power of custom, habit, and the undeniable feeling of belief that arises from repeated experience.
And if you acknowledge that foundation, that deep reliance on custom and feeling, how might that change the way you approach new information, new claims, especially those that seem to run counter to your ingrained expectations and experiences? What standard of evidence do they need to meet?